Briefly about the recommendations to the government and the prison ministry, and Vivian will then talk about Parliament and the international community. So first of all, recommendations to the government and Parliament. Let me begin by making a general comment about the relationship between prisons and wider government policy on good governance and justice issues. And these comments apply to all countries, not only to Georgia. Prisons do not exist in a vacuum or in isolation. They are part of a criminal justice spectrum which begins with the commission of a crime, goes on through the detection and investigation of a crime, onto the prosecution of a crime, then the conviction and sentence of an offender, and finally, perhaps, the imprisonment of that offender. So the prison comes at the end of a long spectrum. And the point that I wish to make is that a change of activity or emphasis at any point in that spectrum, any change in government policy, will ultimately have a clear effect, consequence for the prison administration. For example, one instance from the United Kingdom, in the decade between 1997 and 2007, the government and Parliament introduced 1,400 new crimes. Quite a number of these crimes carried a sentence of imprisonment. And so the consequence, ultimately, for the rest of the criminal justice system and for the number of people in prison was significant. In any country, the police can decide to change their way of working. They can decide that they wish to emphasize a particular kind of offences or crimes or behaviour, and that will affect the number of people who are brought into the system. The prosecution can decide that it's going to change its way of working and its way of charging people. In more general terms, if additional resources are given to the police, if additional resources are given to the prosecution, if additional resources are given to the judiciary, then there will be severe consequences for the prison system. And that's a lesson which must be picked up nationally, but also by the international community when it is considering aid and development. A clear example of what I have just said is the application of a zero-tolerance policy to crime. It's one example of this set of consequences. Now, I do not wish to comment today on the merits of that problem, of that policy, or the disadvantages of that policy of zero tolerance. I merely wish to point to it as an example how a decision made by a government in one area ultimately has a radical effect on the prison system. And if you turn that coin the other way around and look at it from the prison perspective, then it's important to understand that one cannot reform any prison system in a vacuum, in isolation from other government policies and from the rest of civil society. We need to consider who is sent to prison in any society, because the profile of prisoners around the world is the same. A small number are likely to have committed serious crimes and be a threat to the safety of society. But the majority will be men and women who are at the margins of society. People who suffer from mental illness, who are homeless, especially nowadays there will be drug addicts. What all of this says is that society will decide which of these groups and how many of them will be brought into the criminal justice system, and ultimately how many of them will be sent to prison. And so if you wish to talk about prisons as places of reform, then you need to be aware who are the prisoners. And the prison system needs to involve agencies from civil society whose primary aim is to deal with mental illness, with homelessness, with drug addiction. So those are just a few general comments. Let me now turn more specifically to the recommendations. Prisons are by their nature closed institutions. The large, high walls round the prison do not only keep the prisoners in, they also keep civil society out. Prisons may be closed institutions, but they should not be secret institutions. They need to be accountable to civil society and to public authorities. Civil society has a right to know what happens inside its prisons. I would go beyond that to say civil society has an obligation to find out what goes on. And the question which then arises, well, how do you achieve that? How best to exercise this right? And one important way is through having an independent investigative mechanism. And the one which is most topically talked about nowadays in many countries, but specifically in Georgia, is the National Preventive Mechanism, which comes from the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture. Georgia, like so many other countries, has signed the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, which obliges it has agreed to set up a national preventive mechanism to ensure that torture does not happen. And let's remember the title. The title is important: preventive. The purpose of the National Preventive Mechanism is not only to look back to identify where torture has happened, it's to look forward and to prevent torture in the future. Now, this method of monitoring through a national preventive mechanism needs to be consistent. It needs to be done in the same way and with the same rigorous mechanism everywhere. In order to do that, it needs to have a clear set of standards. Those standards need to be understood by the monitors who are carrying out the inspection, but the standards also need to be understood by the people who are being monitored. That is, the people who are responsible for places of detention. Not only prisons. Today we're talking about prisons, but it also applies to police stations, it applies to psychiatric institutions, everywhere where people are deprived of their liberty. And that's what the report means by the need to develop a barometer. In other words, the monitors are able to say, these are the standards which we expect, and in this institution or that institution, they are being met or they are not being met. And the prison authorities can say, we know what is expected of us. This is what we must try to achieve. The National Preventive Mechanism on its own, and in this country the National Preventive Mechanism is headed and personified by the Ombudsman, is not sufficient on its own to achieve this monitoring of places of detention. There needs to be a much wider involvement of civil society via non-governmental organizations, via bodies responsible for education, for cultural, for other activities. They all need to work with the NPM. The NPM is the formal guardian of prevention of torture, but it needs the support of all other groups in society. let me turn briefly now, in the few moments that are left to me, to the recommendations to the Ministry of Penitentiary. Let me start by saying a word about the people who work in prison, about prison personnel. In many countries, the people who work in prison are poorly paid, they are badly trained, and they have little respect in society. People in many countries, people will go to work in prison because they can't find a job anywhere else, they can't find employment elsewhere, particularly in the justice system. But the reality is that working in prison at any level is a very difficult public service. It needs to be seen as a profession. The people who work in prison are working on behalf of all society, everyone in this room, everyone in the country. And the difficult task that they do needs to be recognized. How can we ensure that this might happen? First of all, we need to have a rigorous selection procedure. We need to be quite clear what sort of people we recruit to prison and what sort of people we do not want to work in a prison system. That's extremely important. Secondly, having selected them, we need to give them the proper training so that they know what their job is. Very frequently, as I go around the world, I will be told by people working directly with prisoners, I'm really not sure what my job is. Is it to be a guard? Is it to be a social worker? Is it to be a teacher? Is it to be a reformer? What is it that I'm supposed to be doing? So they need to have a very clear job description. They need to have a very clear statement as to what their task is. And they need to have public respect. So there needs to be almost a media strategy to explain to the public what prison staff are doing. Very specifically, the report recommends the adoption of a code of ethics for prison staff. I've said that I think that working in prison constitutes a profession. And one of the measures of a profession, one of the features which identifies a profession, is if it has a code of ethics. If you look in the justice system in many countries, there will be a code of ethics for judges, there will be a code of ethics for prosecutors, there will be a code of ethics for police, there should be a code of ethics for prison staff. And the Council of Europe a few years ago recognized the need for this. And in 2012, the Council of Europe produced, the ministers of the Committee of the Council of Europe produced a recommendation, a model code of ethics for prison staff. Very simple, just I think 12 principles about the code of ethics. And it ended up by recommending to all 47 member states that each member state should develop a code of ethics for its own country. And that's a very specific recommendation in this report to the government, that there should be a code of ethics for prison staff. I've talked about standards, and since I'm mentioning the Council of Europe, there are 47 member states of the Council of Europe, and of course Georgia is a very active member of the Council of Europe. It has developed a number of standards relating to detention, and one of the most important ones is known as the set of European prison rules, which were updated in 2006. That is another specific area where the Georgian government can look to the standards which it should be applying in its prison and to its prison personnel. The European prison rules begin with 9 simple principles about imprisonment. And there's a strong argument for the government identifying those 9 principles and making sure that every member of prison staff in Georgia knows what these are and knows his or her responsibility to implement them. When talking about staff, another particular group which is of special importance is the healthcare staff who work in prison. There's been reference today to that several times. We saw that yesterday when we went to prison number 8.